would it work in our century? Is it possible to even think in terms of something like this when we have dedicatedly secular societies, and most of us are quite happy that we have secular societies. But how then do we interface the church with secular society, and does our fretting about secularism actually open the church to more secularization than if we didn't fret about it? Those are interesting questions.
Thank you, Vladika. Thank you. Many thanks for the words of introduction, and of course many special thanks for taking care of me during this stay here in British Columbia. And again, it is a great privilege to be on the campus of the university, the Fraser Valley University. I had a chance today to observe the valley, actually, to understand what the university is all about. And it's really magnificent. And as I see, especially today, that the university is just up to the valley. I'm going to talk today about, I was asked to talk about the faith in the public sphere and to talk about Symphony as two separate lectures. Today I'll try to combine these two topics because I think that Symphony, the Byzantine Symphony, I'll come back right now explain what it is. I think it was an interpretation of faith in the public square in late antiquity and medieval Christianity. We can interpret Symphony as a way of presence of the church in the public square in the Roman Empire. And it's interesting to explore how it worked and how it didn't work, and what was improved and what was lost in result of transition from the symphonic models of relationship between the church and the public square in the modern times. First of all, I would say that actually there was no such a thing as symphony. Symphony is a rather modern construct. I'll explain why. Symphony presupposes that there are two subjects, distinct subjects, which are in harmony with each other, which have a symphonic relationship with one another. So it presupposes two subjects. Which means that these subjects are distinct, and these subjects are separated or have been separated from each other, which is a modern idea about separation of church and state. And this separation didn't exist in Byzantium or in the Roman Empire. Well, Byzantium is another construct, artificial construct. Byzantium never existed. There was no such a thing as Byzantium. There was Roman Empire. And if you asked Byzantines how they understood themselves and call them Byzantines, they would be just, would not understand you, because they identify themselves as Romans. And still, even during the time after collapse of the Roman Empire, both in the West and in the East, under the Ottoman rule, the Byzantine, the Orthodox Christians called themselves, and still call themselves, Rum, which means Romans. So Romans was the main identity of the people, and the empire was Roman, and it understood itself as exactly the Roman Empire. And even though the emperors became Christians, starting from Constantine, they considered themselves continuing the line of Caesar, of great emperors of the pagan past, and they understood their mission as completion, as fulfillment of the role that the ancient emperors played in the Roman Empire. So this moment is important to understand self-identity of the of the Roman Empire. Well, symphony is a modern concept. We have invented this concept of symphony because we have the experience of separation between church and state. A kind of experience that the Romans never had. That's why if they spoke about symphony, they implied something different from what we imply. Second thing is that symphony was always a kind of ideal. Symphony means harmony. Symphony means friendly and very amicable relationship between the church and the state. Partnership, equal partnership, which never existed in Byzantine. And symphony as an ideal, is anachronic first, but also the historical incarnations of symphony as they were, sometimes are wrong when we present them. In the 18th century, a German historian, Justus Henning Böhmer, a professor of history at the University of Halle, developed two concepts, Caesaropapism and Papo-Caesarism. He actually used two words, Papo-Caesarea and Caesaropapia. He invented these concepts to denote the difference between the Eastern model of church-state relationship and the Western model of church-state relationship. Caesaropapism became a very successful term, and it was understood, and it is still understood, as a model of symphony, an ideal model of symphony, when it gets implemented in reality, it leads to the emperor overtaking the church, when the emperor is really the main figure in the church. Papo-Caesarism is when the patriarch or the pope overtakes and becomes the main figure of the church. So we can present if there is a marker, I wonder. It's here. I'll just show.
How we cross carry them around.
Oh, okay. It's okay. Well, I will just, let us imagine that symphony as a model presupposes there are two entities, church and state, and they are on the same level, okay? Papo-Caesarism means that the Pope overtakes the state, right? Caesaropapism presupposes that the state overtakes, like this. But in all three cases, we deal with two entities, the church and the state. And this is wrong, because it was not at all an idea of the Romans. That's why both the idea of Caesaropapism and Papo-Caesarism is wrong, anachronic. And the idea of symphony as an ideal of the relationship is also wrong. Okay? Because actually the church and the state in the Roman Empire, after conversion of the Roman Empire, to the minds of the Romans, constituted one entity, one thing. They didn't distinguish them. And it makes sense, because, well, what is the church? What is the empire? They are people. They are the same people. You cannot say that this part of people, this kind of crowd of people belongs to the church, and the other crowd of people belongs to the state. This is wrong. They are the same people. That's why it makes sense to consider the church and the state as one single thing, because the same people are both the state and the church. Okay? So that is quite a reasonable and a sane idea, to consider the church and the state as one single entity. As a result, the awareness of the same people about themselves was the same. It was a theopolitical awareness. They considered themselves both as members of the church and members of the state, of the Pax Romana. Well, what helped this understanding is the imagery of the church. There are studies that show that the most spread image of the church, how the church understood itself from the apostolic times, was the image of kingdom of God. There is a variety, dozens of images of the church developed in the early Christian literature. But there was one which was the most powerful one, the most spread one, which was the kingdom of God. Actually, that was the image coined by Christ himself. There is a nice saying, I think it's by Runner, that Christ did not establish the church, he established the kingdom of God. He didn't preach the church, he preached the kingdom of God. And this is right. That's why the idea of kingdom of God became a very popular presentation of what is the church, even before the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity. And when conversion occurred, this exactly image contributed to the idea that the church and the state are the same, because they are both kingdoms. And they are kingdoms that are related to each other in some way. And this was exactly the task of some imperial, well, as we call them, imperial ideologies like Eusebius, to draw a connection line between the kingdom of Caesar and the kingdom of God. The idea was that the kingdom of Caesar is the image of the kingdom of God, that it is a reflection, an earthly reflection of what is the kingdom of God. And again, because the church is not exactly a reflection, the church is real, so there is also, an embodiment, a full embodiment of the kingdom of God on earth. And it finds itself in the confines of the Roman Empire, which converted to Christianity. That's why this reflection is simultaneously a fulfillment, right, of the kingdom of God. Still, there is some kind of distinction, certainly, a distinction which, the theologians at that time had an idea of difference between distinction and division. Distinction and difference. Difference is between two things. Distinction is between ideas belonging, describing the same thing. This was exactly the idea of Cyril of Alexandria about humanity and divinity of Christ, when he said that the two natures, or he didn't call them natures, the humanity and divinity in Christ, they are distinguished, the theoria moni, only in imagination, only through contemplation, but in reality they are the same Christ. That is the idea of unity for Cyril of Alexandria. He said, Christ is one in reality, empirically. The disciples just touched him, spoke to him, conversed with him as one single thing, subject. We can only imagine distinction between humanity and divinity in him. And this is exactly the way how Byzantines understood the difference or distinction between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Caesar. before Cyril, of course. It started before Cyril, but again, Cyril did not invent this kind of distinction. So it's helpful to have in mind Christological formulas to understand the way how Byzantines perceived their own, political and social reality. How Byzantines perceived the church in the public square for themselves. This distinction presupposed that the kingdom is the same, even though there is a distinction between the kingdom as the kingdom of God and its reflection in the earthly realm, as the Pax Romana, as the Imperium Romanum. They certainly distinguished between them, but didn't separate them from each other. Another image of Christ which became popular, not as popular as the kingdom of God, but the image of the body of Christ, which goes back to Paul, certainly, but with the image which was enhanced during the Christological controversies, because the entire Christological debate about who Christ is and what he is contributed to development of idea of church as the body of Christ, and it became gradually one of the most important and spread image of the church, of what is the church. And this exactly also helped Byzantines, the Romans, to understand what is their politia, what they call. Politia means, polity, public square. Politia and ecclesia constituted one single body for them. And there was a nice imagery of relationship between church and state as body and soul. For instance, we find this in Epanagoga of Leo IV. And he said that we can present the state and the church as body. State is the physical side of it, and soul is the church. But really, Byzantines, being advanced in anthropology, for the Byzantine anthropology, there was no really difference between body and soul. It was the same thing. So Byzantines in this regard were not very much Platonic. They didn't really separate body from soul. And you find actually this in particularly, I think, in Emesius of Nemessa, in anthropology of him, but most strikingly, I think we find it in anthropology of John of Damascus. So imagine now, the Byzantines presented the church and the state as a body with a physical side of it, meaning implying the state, and the spiritual side of it, implying the church. But in reality, it is one thing. So this is another indication why they perceived the church and the state not as two entities, not as two bodies, but as one single body, was one single entity. This entity had the same consciousness. It had the same subject. It had the same self-awareness. The people did not say, I belong to the church and I don't belong to the politia. Or they didn't think that I belong to the politia. Well, of course, if they were Christians, and I don't belong to the church. If they were not Christians, if they were pagans, of course, they didn't understood this in these terms. But again, even when they were pagans, and this is exactly the idea behind politeia in the Hellenic kingdoms. For the Hellenic kingdoms, which this idea of them, of these kingdoms, influenced immensely formation of the Christian idea of politeia, there was no separation between the religious component in the society and the political component in the society. It was exactly the same. And this was a great influence of the Hellenic political philosophy upon the Byzantine political philosophy. And I would argue that this concept of one single entity, theopolitical entity, which only theoretically, on the level of contemplation, distinction, politeia and ecclesia were distinguished, this model was common for both West and East. It was no difference between West and East in this regard, I firmly believe. So this German concept of Caesaropapism and Papo-Caesarism is wrong. Is wrong also because it divides the Western and Eastern traditions, and they were really close to each other. Of course, there were some differentiations, but those differentiations just prove this idea of common approach to what is the church and what is the state in Byzantium, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The difference is presented by scholars through the concept of two cities in Augustine and the concept of two swords in the writings of Pope Gelasius. The concept of Augustine presupposes that there are two cities. One is the city of God, and the other is the fallen city, which leads us easily to a suggestion that he speaks exactly about difference, not just distinction, but difference between politeia and ecclesia, where ecclesia is the city of God and politeia is the city of politics. But this is a posterior Augustinianism, a posterior interpretation of Augustine, which does not exactly speak correctly about Augustine himself. For Augustine, there was no difference. There was no such a thing as city of God and city of evil, of fallen city, existing separately from each other. They were two concepts that describe the same reality. In real life, for Augustine, they were intermingled. So for Augustine, there was one thing, theopolitical thing, and you can only distinguish between two aspects of this thing. And he said it clearly that until the second coming, all the two cities will coexist, will influence each other. If we take the concept of Gelasius, who wrote about two swords, one spiritual and one political, stressing a kind of difference between political and theological, okay, let us not forget that Gelasius did not speak about two subjects, two people who have swords. He spoke about two swords in two hands of the same person. Okay? It's not just one person has one sword and the other person has another sword. It's about one single person who has two swords, which exactly means that for him it was one single theopolitical subject with two activities. Now we come to our conversation about wills and energies, the topic which became exactly in the period of Gelasius on stake and became discussed widely in the Byzantine theology. So we can rather speak about two energies, activities of the same nature, and the nature was single, theopolitical nature of the church and of the state. So, my point up to now is to demonstrate that why the concept of symphony, as we understand it commonly, and the concept of Caesaropapism and Papa-Caesarism don't apply to that time. Because when we try to apply them, we come out of our common perception, post-Enlightenment conception of separation between state and church, something that didn't exist in Byzantine. Okay? Any questions so far? Yeah.
You could argue, ideally, they were separate.
Yeah.
Rome was fulfilling its ideal, so the distortion of the one.
Yeah.
Or there's a distinction
Yeah.
between kingdom of God and even when the question that city of God is critiquing the aberrations of
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's right. That's exactly, well, it was greatly, if you want, a self-criticism. It was a criticism from one side of the same body towards the other side of the same entity, of the same nature. Don't forget that Ambrose, he was a highly ranked clerk of the Roman state himself. And this is actually, this is an interesting indication that how often political figures from the imperial court passed to the ecclesial service. Take Photius, for instance, probably the most striking example, or Ambrose. Well, it strikes us. Well, we cannot imagine really how, say, a prime minister of Canada can become, I don't know, the Archbishop of Canada of the OCA. It would be strange, right? Because, well, we consider the church as a kind of entity that has its own statute, and you have to have the entire career in the church before you become the archbishop. But it was a career within the same body for Ambrosius, because there was no difference between the career of a clerk and the career of an ecclesial figure. For him, he had an ecclesial career. He had it before he was elected. The same Photius, he had an ecclesial career as far as he advanced as a clerk, as really an important minister in the court of Constantinople. And when they did something to the emperors, they wanted to correct a colleague. Not just a person from another realm. No, a person from the state, from the same framework, right? Who didn't do his work properly, who made mistake. In the power, in the name, with the power and in the name of the church, certainly, of his office, of his own office. That's why I think it doesn't mean the criticism that the position of Ambrose towards Theodosius, that it does not imply that they were considered as two different people from two different realms. No, it was a collegial kind of critique, action from a colleague.
It wasn't critiquing the ideal, it was critiquing the aberration of the idea.
Exactly. And for Ambrose, again, well, in the same, it does not apply to Ambrose, but it applies to other figures. When in the same body, of theopolitical body, there was certainly a rivalry. As it was a rivalry between the candidates for emperor, for instance. So it was a rivalry between the person from the church and the person from the empire. Normally, the emperors took the upper hand. Normally. And this was certainly a symphony, which meant a strictly hierarchical construction with the emperor on top of it. But sometimes the patriarchs took the upper hand. Just take Mikhail Kerularius, for instance. He lived in the same time with Cardinal Humboldt, who became Pope, and they actually claimed the same rights for themselves. They tried to take, using the weakness of the political figures in the state, they tried to take over. And it's interesting that they did not do this in the name of the church. There is a funny episode about Michael Kerularius that he not only claimed authority, political authority for himself, but he also dared to wear purple shoes. That was a great scandal, because only the emperor was allowed to have purple, dress and shoes. For Michael, it meant that he wanted to walk the shoes of the emperor, literally. He did not play a patriarch as a distant, figure. He played a person who took over of the same theopolitical organism. Now as the patriarch, not as the emperor. And the same, I think, happened to Rome. It's interesting that if you take Rome, of course, well, there was some difference between East and West, because in the West, the western part of the Roman Empire collapsed under the barbarians, right? And it was a shock. And interestingly enough, that even though for a long time, quite a long time, a couple of centuries, the church lived without a proper partner there, though its partner was quite remote in Constantinople. On the first opportunity, when the Carolingians took over and started restoring the imperial project for the western part of the Roman Empire, immediately they restored this symphonic model of relationship with the church. They immediately embarked on the model that the Byzantines had at the same time, because Charlemagne became appointing bishops. The entire argument about investiture emerged from that. Investiture was not an abnormal thing. It was not a violation. It was a norm of the time for both East and West. And nevertheless, just because the West obviously had some experience of independent existence, they began fighting back, and they tried to restore authority of the Pope over the bishops. And thus we have the Gregorian reforms that eventually led to shift of powers when the Pope took an upper hand in the political matters. And this was not that the church as entity took over the state. No, the same organism, but one center, one of the figures just took over within the same body, their political body. That was all about papacy. And essentially the Byzantines tried to do the same. The argument, for instance, of Photius, when the Macedonians, Basil in particular, tried to redefine relationship between the church and the state, Photius produced a document, the Panagogie. Obviously, he was the person who was behind the document, which was not accepted, but which indicated one important thing. He tried to claim extra authority for the patriarch vis-a-vis the emperor, which was exactly the same thing that happened after during the Gregorian reforms, as a reaction to Carolingian, symphonic relationship with the state, with the church. So when the Byzantines at the time accused the Westerners of something, they did not object against some new model of relationship with the state. No, they wanted the same kind of model of relationship with the state. What they And they did not accuse the West actually about their own model of primacy, because they wanted the same kind of primacy for themselves. What was the essence, the core of their quarrel? Who would implement, who would embody this model? Rome or Constantinople? It was not a question of the model. It was a question of who would put to practice this model. Okay.
Does this mean that it was a theocracy?
Well, it was theocracy, certainly. It was theocracy both in the East and in the West. Theocracy was the only model that existed, because they believed that they rule, both the church and the state, they rule in the name of God. And they tried to implement their ideas about relationship with God in their political and ecclesial life. And I think Stephen Runciman was right when he wrote the book and titled it Byzantine Theocracy. It was all about theocracy, both in the East and in the West. The difference is that theocracy was understood differently. And moreover, this kind of theocracy, evolved. Theocracy, Byzantine theocracy, was not a constant, was not an unchangeable thing. It changed all the time. And it was reinterpreted several times. It was reinvented, actually, several times. And it's an interesting topic as such to regard how the concept of how the model of relationship, or symphony, you can call it symphony if you want, but be cautious to understand it properly, how it evolved as such. And certainly it evolved in Byzantium, and it still evolves even now. So the concept of symphony has become extremely popular nowadays, almost a myth, and it has nothing to do with what was at the time. But still it is very vital. If you take, well, the Romanian church, the Russian church, the Greek church, they all speak, or they imply, they mean some kind of symphony when they develop their relationship with the state. And this is, I believe, in this regard, symphony is very much like autocephaly, another crucial point for important issue and category for the Orthodox thinking. Autocephaly is not equal to itself through the centuries. Autocephaly is a concept which was reinvented several times. Sometimes it meant just the opposite to what it had meant before. And nowadays, autocephaly is a thing which is a new thing, but the same name. This always happened to the Orthodox. We don't acknowledge changes through which we go through. We have had a number of reformations, I believe, but because we believe in our consistency, we don't acknowledge them. So we believe that there was always an eternal category of autocephaly or symphony, but we don't acknowledge how many times they changed over the centuries. I believe that this theocracy, the Roman theocracy if you want, it had two basic incarnations. One you can call New Jerusalem, and the other you can call New Rome. And it was not just about a particular New Jerusalem or a particular New Rome. It was about many New Jerusalems and many New Romes that were established over centuries. So we can consider a sequence of New Jerusalems and New Romes. What are the features of these two incarnations of this Christian theocracy? New Rome is normally, it corresponds more to what was called by Germans Caesaropapism, when the political power, the politia, played more substantial role than ecclesia. While New Jerusalems are those cases when ecclesia played more substantial role than politia. even though they constituted one single entity. We should not forget that they were one thing, but the distribution of powers, of roles, was a bit different here and there. I would argue that Constantinople was first established as a New Jerusalem, not a New Rome. The idea, obviously, we do not know actually what Constantine believed and what were his ideas, but I think we could say that we could guess from what Eusebius at least says about him that he envisaged the new capital as a New Jerusalem. He saw the empire, at least Eusebius says so, as a reflection of the kingdom of God. Eusebius presents Constantine as a reflection of God himself. And obviously Constantinople was a reflection of the heavenly Jerusalem. So it was a New Jerusalem. But soon, because Constantine was smart, he was not really as born anew as maybe he could be believed. He was a convert, certainly, but he was a reasonable convert. And I think he realized quite soon that New Jerusalems cannot really sustain themselves politically. And in fact, the posterior development, the incarnations of New Jerusalems demonstrate that politically New Jerusalems are not sustainable. They are very vulnerable, and they tend to just to fall apart. They need to reestablish themselves all the time in new places, maybe as new people, as new political entities, but cannot really survive for a long time. While New Romes, they are almost eternal. And there was a number of them, actually. Not just Constantinople, but also, even in the time of Constantine, he considered cities like Trier in Germany, cities like Sofia, Serdica in his time, Milan as New Romes. And after that, medieval capitals of the medieval Bulgarian, Serbian kingdoms, and the capital of the medieval Muscovite kingdom principality claimed this identity of New Rome for themselves. So what should be should be said further, that we have different incarnations of the same idea of symphony or theocracy. Probably it's more appropriate to speak about theocracy than symphony. Theocracy in which sense? In theocracy that in the sense that, well, how theocracy works in both New Rome and Jerusalem. In the case of New Jerusalem, this is almost a direct rule of God through his priests, the emperors who are anointed by, or not necessarily emperors, the rulers, some kind of rulers. But the priests are the main kind of mouth of God, of will of God. In the case of New Rome, it is mostly the emperor, the ruler, who speaks on behalf of God, who expresses, who knows the will of God. And there is a huge imagery developed concerning the emperor in the setting of the New Rome. First, I said that the emperors were presented as the image of God. This is, for instance, how Eusebius understood Constantine. Sometimes they were presented as image of Christ. For instance, Constantine VII in the Book of Ceremonies, an important book, he says, the emperor imitates Christ, he says clearly. There was a ceremony, and ceremony was an important source of imagery or reflection of how the imperial power was understood in Rome. For instance, the emperor had this habit of washing on the Good Thursday, of washing feet of poor. What now Pope does, or the Patriarch sometimes, the Patriarchs do. This is initially the faculty of and the responsibility, duty of the emperor to wash feet of poor during the on the day of Good Thursday, because the emperor was understood as Christ himself, as an image of Christ. Then this idea was transferred upon the Patriarchs. Then the emperor was also understood as Peter, as an image of Peter, the apostle. Thus, Leo III, in his preface to Ecloga, which was written around 726, compared the office of the emperor with the office of Peter. He says, "Since God has put in our hands the imperial authority according to his good pleasure, and given us therein an acknowledgment of the love which we cherish toward him, in reverence bidding us after the manner of Peter." So he says, so he considered himself as a person acting in the manner of Peter. Also, the emperors understood themselves as apostles, and hence is the idea of his apostles, equal to apostles. Constantine, for instance, built as his mausoleum a huge church of 12 apostles in Constantinople. And the rationale behind building this huge church was that he wanted to be interred there as one of the apostles. Later on, this idea of his apostolos transformed itself to the idea of, if you preach, if some political figure, say, preaches, or not necessarily political, also political figure, preach a gospel to non-Christians, then he or she is his apostles. Such was Saint Nino of Georgia. She was she converted the Georgian people, or a big part of the Georgian people. Christianity was declared his apostolos, equal to the apostle. Saint Cyril and Methodius, two bishops who preached gospel to the Slavs, were also declared his apostoli. So it was a further development of the concept. But the initial idea was that the emperor is his apostolos, whoever he is. For instance, Constantine V adopted for himself the title 13th Apostle, the title that now the Patriarch of Alexandria has. But initially it was also the imperial title. Then, interestingly enough, that Constantine himself became a model for the emperors. So the emperors after Constantine understood themselves as Constantines. Now, it was very important in Byzantium to be an image of something important or someone important. This gave you legitimacy. This gave you authority. This gave you legal status. And it was also a habit that the emperors named their first sons as Constantines. Not only they understood themselves as Constantines, but also they wanted their successors to be Constantines as such. The emperors also understood themselves as bishops. It was very common, and there is a number of testimonies about this, starting with Eusebius, who called Constantine, well, he said that Constantine called himself the bishop of those who are outside, which is an obscure phrase, but Nevertheless, he meant that he's a bishop. Sometimes they call themselves the archbishops or bishops of bishops. They also call themselves priests, and it was very common to understand the office of the emperor as the office of priest. All this fitted exactly the idea of theocracy. That when God speaks through the emperor and acts through the emperor, and the emperor embodies the entire fullness of the theopolitical organism of the empire. Well, let us speak about the evolution of the idea of symphony, or of the idea of theocracy. It started with Eusebius. It started with Eusebius, who offered the first interpretation of symphony. And in the Eusebius's, from the Eusebius's perspective, this symphony was almost eschatological. It was really metaphysical. It was about embodiment of the kingdom of God, and the emperor, in his interpretation, received the heavenly mandate, which is very similar to the Chinese concept of the heavenly mandate. The emperor was the mediator between the kingdom on earth and the kingdom of God. And it's interesting how the idea of the reception worked at that time. If the emperor was wrong in doing something, he was declared an usurper, a tyrant. He lost divine mandate, and he could be dethroned very easily, just killed, on the hippodrome. It was a direct democracy at that time. If you don't like the emperor, you just kill him. It happened when the emperor lost this kind of idea of divine mandate, because he's under his rule, and it's not necessarily that he was to be blamed, but under his rule there were famines, right? Wars, civil wars, and so forth. This was regarded as a curse of God, and the curse of God against the emperor primarily. This is very similar to the Chinese concept of divine mandate, because if the emperor if something happens wrong under an emperor, he loses his legitimacy and can be just removed from his office. Just because the kingdom of God meant that you have access to God, to knowledge of God, you know how God is. That is the reality of the kingdom of God, right? You cannot really discern about what God is. You have the single idea, one single idea about what God is, shared by everyone. It means uniformity of doctrine, which needs to be secured by the emperor as the divine mediator. Thus, the emperors became the ensurers of the unity of doctrine in the empire. Under Constantine, it was a bit different. Constantine did not consider himself an ensurer of the unity of doctrine so much, though later, after Nicaea, under the influence of bishops, he proceeded to this concept. But what Constantine did to make sure that the rite is the same, that the entire church celebrates the Easter on the same day, and that the church celebrates liturgy in the same way everywhere in the churches, in the basilicas, which Constantine built a lot. This has to do with the concept of the cultus, Roman cultus, that the emperors in the Roman Empire before Constantine didn't really care what people believed. They cared what people practiced as right, as religious right. They made sure that the correct formulas were spoken out. They made sure that the sacrifices were offered in the same way publicly as public events. And Constantine actually continued this line. He made sure, and these were decisions of the Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, that the Easter is celebrated on the same day, that priests are taken care of. They are exempted from taxes. They are exempted from civil military service. That they are really they are really the priests, not just the leaders of the community, Christian communities, but priests, which means sacerdotes, in a Roman sense. He made sure that this happens, that they function in this way. And he did not, yes, he started caring about the unity of doctrine, but he tolerated a good deal of diversity within his empire. Who became more concerned about unity of doctrine was Theodosius, who actually began the policy of imposing unanimity and the single doctrine throughout the empire. Under him, the uniformity of doctrine became a kind of imperial, categorical imperative in the full sense of the sense. Imperative, in terms of empire, categorical for everyone in the empire. Because they believed that and they were instructed in this way, that if they secure that the same faith is kept everywhere, this secures the unity of the empire. They cared about the unity of the empire, and they cared about the welfare of their citizens. This was the way for themselves to gain the heavenly mandate, right, for themselves. And to fulfill this heavenly mandate, they believed, and thus to secure the unity of the empire, was to uphold the same doctrine everywhere. It was almost magic. It was almost, at that time, the theologians developed the idea that if you believe in a wrong way, as a heresy, in a heretical way, this endangers your salvation. Your belief affects what happens to your soul. In its political and social explication, it meant if the entire body of the church empire believes wrongly, this affects the integrity of this body, of the church empire. That's why, as it is important for a person to believe in an orthodox way for his or her salvation, so it is important for the entire empire to believe in the same way for the integrity of the empire. Okay? So this idea of heresy and orthodoxy, while explicated to the political plane, so to say, meant that the unity of faith should be kept everywhere in the empire. Yes. Yeah.
Where do you see the desert qualities, Symphony,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Where do they stand in this model that you're articulating?
I'm just going to say about this, to speak about the descent to this mainstream theology, which was remarkable because the descent to this mainstream produced the brightest theologians, actually. The most important theologians disagreed with some points of this ideology. and we enjoy their theology as actually the treasure of Christian theology, and exactly Anthony Ibaglia's goal there. I'm going to talk about this shortly. I just want to depict the picture how what was the political philosophy of Byzantines at the time, and how they understood theocracy. So uniformity of doctrine is connected with Theodosius. Then Justinian, he made another step, and Justinian actually developed the idea. He married theology and law. His idea was that essentially only those things are legal, which means they are obligatory for the subjects, for his subjects, which are passed by him as law, even if those things are doctrinal. So if anything related to faith, to politics, to welfare, well-being of the subjects of his empire is not legalized as law, it cannot be applied. This relates to the doctrine, this relates to the discipline, church discipline, and this relates to the political things. Thus, this is the basic idea behind his Codex Juris Civilis, his Codex of law, which legalizes everything related to both the church and the state in a single codex. This is an important development, which means that theocracy can work, can function only as law. Theocracy being legalized. This is the input of Justinian. If a council of the church, say, adopts a theological formula, this formula should be issued, promulgated as a law. Only then it is valid. And it is valid. It is not only valid, it is obligatory as a law. If there are issues in the discipline of clergy or monks, those issues can be addressed only through a law. And then it is not just a solution to the problem, it is an obligation for those upon whom this is directed. This is essentially the idea of canon law initially. Canon law are norms of discipline put as law, expressed as law in legal terms of its time. The idea of dogma at the same time was the same, but it is not the discipline, it is the doctrine now, but again presented as law. Okay, theocracy has become legalized, has become a law under Justinian, and this is an important development under him. And it's interesting, well, I don't want to go very much into detail, but I think a kind of climax of the development of theocracy we find in Balsamon, the Patriarch of Antioch, in the 8th, 9th century, and who actually expressed an interesting idea that a lot of ideas where he gave all the theocratic power to the emperor, including the power to appoint patriarchs, to remove bishops, to manage the church entirely. There is an interesting also testimony by Patriarch of Constantinople Anthony IV, who lived in the 14th century, and he wrote a letter to the Grand Duke of Moscow in 1393. This letter was written on the occasion that, the Byzantine state was really weak. It was broken into tiny principalities, and there were doubts to what extent it is legitimate, and particularly doubts from Moscow, and Anthony writes to Moscow. I want to quote him. Once more, with grief, I have heard that your Highness has said certain things about the Emperor in derogation. That is bad. The Emperor is not like local and provincial rulers and sovereigns. He means like you. The emperors convoked the ecumenical councils. By their own laws, they sanctioned what the divine canon said about the correct dogmas and the ordering of the Christian life. Justinian. They determined by their decrees the order of the episcopal sees and set up their boundaries. They managed the entire church. That is Balsamon. So we find, all the ideas about theocracy in this statement. The church ordained the emperor, anointed him, and consecrated him emperor and autocrat of all the Romans, that is, of all Christians, including your subjects. Just one sec. And then he continues. It is impossible for Christians to have the church without having the emperor, because the empire and the church constitute one unity and one community. That is a very important statement, which exactly reflects what the Byzantines believed about the church and the state. So this meant that indeed it was a single entity, and no one doubted this. But, of course, in reality it meant that the emperors often abused their power, and the emperors often abused the church. The real life is always more complicated than the ideas. And this posed the Byzantines in front of a difficult task of find the ways of containing the absolute power of the emperors, both in the church and in the state. This was a difficult problem, and they tried to approach it from different perspectives. One perspective was actually the idea of symphony as such. The idea of symphony is an idea, at least in the Byzantine interpretation, not our modern interpretation, but in the Byzantine interpretation, it itself is a limiting concept, limiting towards the absolute imperial power, because it means that there are limitations of the same character that are the rights of the emperor. The emperor has his rights from God. He has divine mandate. But exactly from the same source, there are limitations upon him. Symphony tries to contain the imperial power. When the emperor, during the enthronement, comes, he is led by the patriarch hand in hand to the church, to St. Sophia. Before he enters the altar, he takes off his crown. He makes a prostration, a very rare thing. The emperor is not supposed to make prostration. Everyone else is supposed to make prostration. Actually, at the Byzantine court, they had the same Chinese kowtow ceremonies. You had to prostrate yourself before the emperor all the time. And there were a few instances when the emperor himself prostrated himself. It was not the case with the Chinese emperors. It was the case with the Roman emperors. And this was an effect of symphony, the limiting effect of symphony. He had to understand that he reflects, he not contains, he reflects the divine kingdom. And the symphony contains imposes certain limitations upon his power. Then, and this is reflected exactly in right. The entire Byzantine theocracy is described, is best reflected in the right, especially the right of enthronement. The way how the emperor appeared and disappeared, how he was dressed. Actually, you can see how it existed in the modern Orthodox liturgies, especially bishops' liturgies. Everything is taken from the emperors, from their clothes to, to the way how the bishops put on their mitres, how they take off. This is imperial completely. This is how the emperor actually was putting on and removing his crown during the liturgy. So the bishops do now. If you take, say, the custom of singing Многое лето, many years, this is the imperial greeting. This is the way how the Byzantines greeted the emperor, not the bishops. But now, well, bishops now, after emperors were removed, the bishops concentrated everything that they had. Actually, the emperors have nowadays, which is nice. You can see, well, at least you can go to the church and see how Byzantine was. But just remember that in place of the bishops had to be the emperor at that time. There was also some limitations imposed upon emperors in terms of morality. There was a genre developed, well, in late antiquity, particularly by people like Agapetus, a deacon Agapetus. They called the mirror of princes, so to say, where they described how the emperor, in order to have a divine heavenly mandate, had to behave, what kind of morale he had to embody. And this kind of mirror of emperors, mirror of princes, was a nice way to say the emperor, you are a great man, nice man, but there are some limitations. If you misbehave, you lose your mandate. And finally, there was a tradition of dissidence. There was a tradition of critique to the emperor when the emperor overstepped. Well, it was normal. It is abnormal for us completely. We don't understand this, how it may happen. But it happened often, and it was considered as a norm when the emperor intervened into the affairs of faith, of doctrine. There were successful interventions and not successful. Successful intervention was, for instance, Nicene Council. It was certainly an intervention of the emperor. Then a successful project was the Neo-Chalcedonian project by Justinian. The Fifth Ecumenical Council was a political council. It was a project conceived by Justinian, carried out by Justinian, and it was exactly the case when the emperor put his hand into the doctrine. Heraclius in the 7th century tried to do the same, to produce the same kind of theopolitical project, and produce this doctrine about one single will and energy of Christ. It was rejected. He failed, even though he tried to imitate Justinian in this. Iconoclasm is probably the most unsuccessful project. It was purely the imperial thing. It was the invention of the emperors. They carried it out. They did everything possible to promote this iconoclasm, and they failed. And this was a major blow to the imperial authority. We changed many things in the church and in the imperial ideology. I don't want to go into that detail, but just state this. The dissent, the critique to this theocracy, imperial theocracy, started as early as in the 4th century. One of the earliest, probably, critics was Hosius of Cordoba, who resisted the attempts of Constantine. Constantine was an Arian. Even though he convoked the ecumenical council, after that he was converted to Arianism. Actually, he was baptized by Arians, and he died as an Arian. And people, some people in the church, not all of them, rather exceptions, they criticized him for that. First was Hosius of Cordoba, then Athanasius, certainly, of Alexandria, who took a lot from the fathers of the desert, and he was really inspired by people like Anthony the Great, and he did not communicate with Evagrius, obviously, but certainly monasticism at that time was represented a kind of alternative to the imperial power, as it was the case also with, and actually monasticism, as we see it, it always tried to question the imperial authority, particularly during the iconoclasm, and iconoclasm was overthrown owing to the monks. It changed during the Middle Ages, when the emperors, after the crisis of iconoclasm, the emperors started seeking support of the monks for their own legitimacy. They started building Mount Athos, endorsing all those monasteries and running them, and they actually won the monks on their side. And the monks became the source of legitimacy for the emperor at the later stage after iconoclasm.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Let's say with Mount Athos, was that also a way for them to put monks away somewhere?
No, to put them in, to make them working for them. Exactly. If you want to eliminate a danger, you need to be on top. To lead it. So to say, monks were a danger. Were a challenge to the imperial power, and at some stage the emperors understood that it's better to have it well with the monks and to win them for themselves, and they managed. Then among the dissidents who criticized the imperial power theocracy, this kind of implementation of theocracy, it's interesting that no one of the fathers criticized theocracy as such. We don't find this kind of criticism. We find criticism of abuses, and one of the abuses was the intervention of the emperors into the matters of doctrine. So Chrysostom was certainly one of them. Interestingly, Procopius of Gaza was one of them. He wrote a very nasty treatise against Justinian. He condemned Justinian. He said Justinian was a semi-human, semi-demon. He didn't sleep because he was a half demon. So this kind of criticism. Well, certainly much more substantial criticism was by Maximus. Maximus himself never criticized the theocracy as such, but he criticized the capacity of the emperor as a priest, something which was widely believed. And when Maximus was a strange man, he was against every kind of mainstream. He was really a troublemaker. He was against the mainstream doctrine. He was against the mainstream belief that the emperor was the priest. Everyone was happy about that. And he objected. John of Damascus was certainly a person against, for a very simple reason. John of Damascus lived in caliphate. He was never in caliphate, in the Umayyad caliphate. His father was a top official he was a tax collector, actually, chief tax collector in Damascus under the caliphs. And John of Damascus himself, it's interesting, he never stepped into the Byzantine Roman world. He always lived outside. And this developed in him an interesting approach to the Roman Empire. He was critical about the intervention of the emperors to the matters of faith as regards iconoclasm. And it's some people, when they don't belong to big empires and they live outside, they dream of those empires. They get over obsessed, by those empires. Maximus, John of Damascus, was not this kind of guy. His separation from Rome, the fact that he lived under Muslims in Caliphate, made him more realistic, more critical about the imperial power in Rome, and this is quite obvious in his writings against the emperors. Theodore of Studite, the Studite monk, he was another critical voice. Photius was critical in a very polite, very nice way. He himself was a politician primarily, and so forth. Well, so we see that the church and the state actually existed in Byzantium in the same way. Does it mean first that the church, that the state, that there was this kind of reduction of the church-state relationship just to the relationship between the ecclesial powers and the church powers? It was certainly so. This contributed to the idea of a very narrow understanding of the church as the body of priests and bishops. The state was represented by senate and clerks. The church became represented, especially in this kind of dialectics, in this relationship, in this evolution of the church-state relationship, gradually became represented by bishops and priests as corresponding body of governors of the same thing.
Like a senate and a house or something.
Yes, exactly. Well, the bishops were considered as the council of bishops, the councils, were considered as gathering of the senate, and they were conducted in the form of the council or of the gathering of the senate. The priests were considered as clerks, local clerks in the communities. And the patriarch was himself a kind of vis-a-vis of the emperor, the alter ego of the emperor. So this was one thing. This contributed to reduction, this relationship to the reduction of the church to its body of the bishops and priests. It certainly contributed to hierarchization of the church, because the emperors adopted this idea that they are the representatives of God. The entire imperial structure was conceived in hierarchical terms, and the same applied to the church because they constituted the same thing. This Neoplatonic idea of hierarchy contributed to formation of the church mentality as hierarchical, which was not natural and Christian, which was contrary actually to the apostolic idea of egalitarianism in the church, when everyone is equal. No slave, no master, no Hellen, no Jew, no person on the top, no person in the bottom. Everyone is equal. So this Christian egalitarianism was really a challenge to the Byzantine hierarchical structure, and actually hierarchies in Byzantine or Neoplatonic hierarchies it won over Christian egalitarianism. It was another consequence of theocracy. At the same time, theocracy was not as bad as we can believe. It was not just about church-state relations. It also included Populus Romanus, Populus Romanum, Romans. It's interesting in the rite, in the ceremonies of the court, there was a fragment, an element of it, when the emperor appeared to the people. The emperor from the imperial palace had a direct entrance, access to the hippodrome. Hippodrome was the public square of the time, of the Byzantine time. Hippodrome was exactly the public space, and the entire populace of the capital was present there. It was faction. There were factions, blues and greens. it's interesting that the political division of those factions were after teams of charioteers. So they were for one or another chariot team, and they were divided politically. So it was a strange mix of sport and politics and theology, because those factions, political factions, expressed themselves in theological terms. For instance, during the Chalcedonian controversies, the Greens were anti-Chalcedonians, the Blues were Chalcedonians, and they were after certain charioteers' team. So it was related to theology, sport, and politics and public sphere. So all politics happened on the hippodrome, or it was expressed on the hippodrome, and the emperor had to appear to the hippodrome. He had a direct access. He had a balcony from the palace to the hippodrome, and he just came out and appeared to the populace. And he was cheered, or he was wooed. Sometimes they killed the emperor if they disliked him, and this happened exactly that in the public square. So there was a way of communication of the emperor with the society. It was not just a bilateral relationship between the church and the society. There was an exodus of the emperor to the society, but it's interesting. It was just a balcony. He could not go to the hippodrome. He stood, quite, isolated from the society. So there was a kind of presence of the emperor in the public square, which meant that there was a kind of presence of the entire theopolitical body in the public square. And as the populace could say, if they were dissatisfied with the emperor, they could just kill him. So they could kill a patriarch or a bishop. If they disliked, the bishop, they just didn't care, they just killed him. So there was a kind of communication, a kind of feedback between the society and the church. And that's why it would be an oversimplification to say that the church-state relations in Byzantine was bilateral and was reduced just to the leadership of the church and leadership of the state. It was a great deal, but not only. So when symphony, as we understand it, as harmony between two powers and partnership between two powers, when they are distant, when the symphony eventually came to be a reality, I think it happened under the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire provided exactly the framework when symphony eventually came to existence. Because the church could not identify themselves with the Muslim state anymore. And the Muslim state could not identify itself with the church separately. So they realized forcefully themselves as distinct bodies. And they were different people because the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, they constituted a separate body of citizens, millet. And the rest, there were the rest also, the Muslims. And, well, there are 4 millets actually. Such entities: Jews, non-Chalcedonian, Armenians, Syrians, and Rum, 4, and Muslims, of course. So they established some kind of a very actually productive way of relationship between the patriarch and the sultan. The patriarch was given a huge deal of authority over his people. He could judge people, those people. He had to taxate them, take care of taxation, judgment, any kind of activities related to those people. He became the ethnarch, actually, of that faction within the Ottoman Empire, and he was responsible, accountable to the sultan. So this was exactly a kind of partnership and relationship when the patriarch represented the church before the civil authority. And of course, this separation between the church and the state in the West happened only with the Enlightenment, much later than it happened in the East. So I think that the first separation between the church and the state happened in the East, and the first model, the new model of relationship, emancipation of the church from the state happened in the East first, and then happened during the Enlightenment, and particularly the French Revolution. Even the Reformation did not contribute to this, because the Reformation just reconstructed the same kind of theopolitical entity. Luther was against Rome. Luther was against church being a political body, but actually he had a new kind of relationship, the same relationship, but on different levels with the local principalities in Germany. So for him, the partners of Symphony, but Symphony in the oldest Byzantine sense, the same body, the same people, but ruled by ecclesial leaders and political leaders together, they were German principalities, not Rome anymore. So, the separation between the church and the state, I think, happened in the West much later, several centuries later, after the East, during the Enlightenment.
In France?
In France, yes, violently, certainly, violently in France, and then, then the American project followed, and then it became a kind of common phenomenon everywhere. And this separation indeed created a space for the society to emerge, when the society became a subject of a distant subject of relationship with the state and with the church. But this is a different kind of story, and I think it's time for Q&As. Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the scripture where it talks about the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our God.
Yeah.
Is that what they're
exactly? I think that's exactly. That's the prophecy about the Roman world. This the theocratic model. Yeah.
What you're saying is, on the one hand, there has been an establishment of imperial model, certain crude or subtle forms of symphony. And then you have in this late Antine period two dissident models.
Yeah.
One accepts the ideal, but critiques the aberration of the ideal.
Yeah.
The other critiques the very ideal itself, the church.
Yeah.
State. And you can find that in the desert.
Yeah.
Movement, but you also find it in urban theologians, whether it's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Certainly.
So you got, so there are those, you have this imperial model, and then there's two different ways of approaching both the theory
Yeah.
and practice.
Yeah. And again,
it's the dissident voice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was not exactly a critique of the model as such. It was not a critique. Well, they did not advocate the separation of this church from the state. No, we don't. I think we don't find any kind of implication of this sort. What they criticized, the abuses of this theopolitical unity of the church and of the state, when they criticized malfunctions, not the model, but malfunctions of that model. And this, I think, this applies to both East and West. In this regard, they are the same. Yeah. Well, they were in the pre-Constantine era, so that's why they were critical about empire. The empire was the incarnation of all evils for them. And they actually, yes, and they lived through the apostolic experience of the church being really a separate subject, a separate entity. And it's interesting that this was encoded somewhere in the DNA of the church. And certainly when the separation of the church and theology and the state happened, even though it was accepted very painfully by the church, but the church came at terms with that eventually. And now more and more churches speak that, well, that's fine to be separate. Why not? I think, and again, I think when we speak about Islam, and this is an important implication of our discussion, Islam, the problems that military Islam or abuses of Islam incur has to do with the political character of Islam. Islam from the very beginning was a theopolitical movement. At the same time, it does not mean that theology and politics are not inseparable in Islam, as in any religion. So probably this Christian experience of separation could be a key, I believe, to try to approach the problems of Islam. Should maybe they also consider a possibility, Islam, of having theology being distilled, separated from politics. Of course, it is harder for Islam because the early Islam did not have the same kind of separation of the church from the state as the Christian communities had. But in terms of the Christianity had the same length, of living together with the state, with the same shared identity, self-awareness with the state, as Islam had with caliphates and empires and so forth. If you take Christianity, it happened to Christianity in the 4th century, and Christianity learned, the Western Christianity learned to live separately in the 18th century, more or less. And Islam lasted from the 6th century, to our days. In terms of time, it's approximately the same. So we have the same strong experience of living together with one shared self-awareness, theopolitical self-awareness. And I think Christianity was really helped by separating from the state. This helped both the state and the church. And probably this may be a solution for Ummah to consider such a possibility, to learn from the Christian church. Yeah. Yes, nowadays it is. It is exactly the case. It is an imagined symphony. People don't really know what symphony was in the Byzantine time. They dream about the symphony and they try to implement it in the modern situation, which is always a new thing. You cannot now restore Byzantine Roman Empire nowadays. It's just impossible. You cannot even restore a part of it. What you essentially do, you dream of a symphony and you create a new theocracy, which is different from the old theocracies. It's a new thing and it's an imagined thing. And I don't think it is helpful under modern conditions. Take it Russian theocracy, modern Russian theocracy, or Romanian, or Greek theocracy, whatever.
Father, I wondered if you'd say something about the British experiment. And particularly I was thinking of it in regards to in the House of Lords, they have the Lord's spiritual and the Lord's temporal.
Yeah.
And in this context, in the most advanced secular societies, in both sides of the sword.
I think what happened to the Anglican Church, to the Church of England, can be interpreted easily in the Eastern terms. First, you can interpret a policy of Henry VII and the Tudorians, the Tudors, in terms of seeking for autocephaly. What they actually tried to do was not to challenge Rome as such, but to secure some autocephaly for themselves, right? That's why I think it is helpful to apply the concept of autocephaly if you want to understand the emergence of the Church of England. And then certainly symphony, which was not invented. So this model of the king being the head of the church was not a new thing. It was Carolingian, certainly. It came back to Carolingians, and it came back to the common model understanding shared by the Western and Eastern Church in the first millennium. What they have now, Brits are really keen on different rudimentary rituals. And they have this House of Lords, which is really rudiment. and they have bishops present there, which is also a rudiment. I think it's a funny decoration for the past, not really something which matters.